In January, the state will inaugurate a new governor and a new state legislature, meaning the election of a new House Speaker. The House Speaker wields the power to call up bills, appoint committee chairs, and steer the direction of a session. Now, that typically benefits a Speaker's region, and as the population across North and Central Louisiana dwindles, this race presents a unique opportunity for our region.
If geography really matters, and I think it does, I think it's very significant in leadership within the state of Louisiana, I think this is our opportunity.
In the past 40 years, only 2 House Speakers have come from districts north of Interstate 10, but that could change in January.
Central Louisiana and North Louisiana has been left out of the legislative process for quite some time.
Of the candidates vying to hold the Speaker's gavel, 2 from Central Louisiana have emerged as top picks, one of those being State Representative Desitel of Marksville.
Our state is at an important moment in history. We're going to look back at this moment, and it's going to define the state of Louisiana for the next 50 years.
Desitel has a business background, which he wants to use to run the House more like a CEO would run a business.
We need to really put more emphasis into our staffing and our personnel and being able to help our fellow legislators become more successful.
And even though he's only going into his 2nd term in office, Desitel sees that as an advantage, saying he's more beholden to members and constituents than someone in their final term. That's where State Representative Jack McFarland would disagree.
Doesn't seem like a big difference, but it is. That experience matters.
McFarland comes from Winfield, where he owns a timber company. He is entering his 3rd and final term in the House, having risen through the ranks to chair the House Ag Committee and Conservative Caucus. He's long held conservative stances fiscally and socially, but believes his experience gives him a leg up.
My ability to communicate with everyone and to be more receptive, and the view by many of those individuals within the legislature that although I am conservative, but very practical in my approach and in my conversations with each one of them.
Regardless of their differences, both McFarland and Desitel agree that it's time their region has a place at the leadership table.
If you look at traditionally where the speakers were from, those areas of the state did better as far as legislation, appropriations, fiscal matters.
You know, I will definitely represent all of the state and still represent those areas, but of course my heart is in Central Louisiana, and I will do everything I can to promote Central Louisiana and give us some opportunities to succeed.
That's where State Representative Mike Johnson of Pineville hopes to play a part.
Regardless of who becomes Speaker, if I could be pro tem, I'm hoping that would elevate, and it traditionally does elevate the opportunity from my district and for the Central Louisiana district.
Johnson has already been involved in the House Speaker race, leading the effort to unite House Republicans to back one candidate for speakership.
The fact that we were able to get 100% of every single Republican, I think sent a signal that I can work with anybody.
Johnson believes he can continue to unite members in the role of Speaker Pro Tem, second in command in the House, working as a liaison between the Speaker and the chamber. House Republicans are set to vote for the member they'll elect to Speaker in December by way of a secret ballot. That member will officially take the gavel in January.